students. Today we are going to discuss about William Empson's Ambiguity. This is taken from his essay Seven Types of Ambiguity, and as we have already discussed about I.A. Richards and F.R. Lewis, along with these two, William Empson forms the Cambridge influence in English critical tradition. And these three, as I have already told you regarding Richards and Lewis, that they form the movement where the importance is laid on the text. This importance has been shifted to the text. So here he is trying to discuss about another aspect of the literary text or its language, what he calls as ambiguous. And in this context, he is giving the example of a pawn. And as you know, a pawn means a play on words that are either identical in sound or very similar in sound, but are sharply diverse in meaning. So he is telling that the pawn or such type of figures of speech, they make the literary text very ambiguous. And he is also differentiating between ambiguity and double meaning. You remember, because sometimes objective questions can be asked whether ambiguity is double meaning, but definitely ambiguity is not double meaning, because double meaning means where two layers of meaning are embedded within the text in a deliberate attempt. But ambiguity can be more than one meaning, and generally it refers to multiple meanings or multi layered meanings. So he is telling that you cannot be sure whether the total effect is ambiguous or not, and that this forces you in some degree to extend the meaning of the term. So he is telling when you use a pawn or such type of devices, it extends the meaning of that particular term within the text. The meaning is not immediately revealed, as the meaning is not fixed, the meaning is not pointed. And such meaning or the extended meaning of the term, it is sometimes considered as witty or deceitful. We sometimes ascribe these qualities in our friends or the person who uses such type of multiple meaning as deceitful or witty. But he is telling that this sense of ambiguity in the language gives room for alternative reactions to the same piece of language. That means why the writer uses the pawn or other such ambiguous literary device. What is the necessity? The writer could have been writing very simple language. Instead of that, why the writer will use that? Because it provides the room for alternative reactions to the same piece of language. And in this way, he is telling that Sometimes the prose statement could be called ambiguous as well. That a simple prose statement could be ambiguous, could be having multiple meaning. Suppose, for example, somebody says, I don't want him in my life. So it may look very simple and innocuous sentence that somebody doesn't want somebody in the living experience, but it can also be interpreted in different ways, where in my life or uh, uh, I don't want him, both can be used like the pawn, like having extended meaning. So Empson is telling that metaphors are also doing the same thing in the literary text. So, due to metaphors, more or less far fetched or more or less complicated, more or less taken for granted, is the normal mode of development of a language. That metaphors are also developing such type of complexity in the language. The moment we are using ambiguity, it gives us a complex perception of our living experience or our mental perceptions in the language. He is also telling words used as epithets are words used to analyze a direct statement, whereas metaphor is the synthesis of several units of observation into one commanding image. So, comparing the epithet and the metaphor, he is telling an epithet is a simple or single direct statement, but metaphor is a synthesis of several units of observation. There are several units of observation blended into one commanding image. Suppose, for example, when we use the metaphor of water, if the water becomes metaphor, the water can suggest so many things. It is primary element of life. It can dissolve most of the things. It is destructive. It is the essence of life, etc., etc. So many units of observation are blended into one image. And it is the expression of a complex idea, not by analysis nor by direct statement, but by a sudden perception of an objective relation. The metaphor gives us a sudden perception of an objective relation. There are objective relation. We have the objectivity of expressing a complexity. But how can we express the complexity? I do this thing, I do that, I do that, I do that, I do that, everything. But instead of that, the moment we use the metaphor, what? I am the donkey. हम तो सबकी गद्दा है. So what happens? The gadha or the donkey becomes the metaphor for all types of works or all types of commands that I obey of different persons, indicating कोई मुझे बाजार भेजता है, कोई मुझे ये घर का काम करना देता है, कोई हमको न्यूज़पेपर लाने देता है, कोई क्या काम करना देता है. तो what happens? So many images, so many ideas are blending into one objective relation. So he is telling that we should look at this concept of language in a text or a literary text, the fundamental situation where it deserves to be called ambiguous or not is that a word or a grammatical structure is effective in several ways at once. Clearly, this is involved in all such richness and heightening of effect, and the machinations of ambiguity are among the very roots of poetry. So, he is telling poetry is basically ambiguous. Why? Because a word or a grammatical structure is constructed in such a manner that it has the richness and heightened effect or machination of ambiguity when it is used in poetry. The poet is not using the simple objective language approach, and Empson is distinguishing between the poetic language and the language of the prose. He is telling that poetry is more ambiguous or uses ambiguity, and the meanings of this kind, according to him, are conveyed much more by poets than by analysts. That is what poets are for. He is telling if poets are not using ambiguous language, they are not poets. Because poetry means ambiguity, or art means ambiguity. They do not want to highlight the thing that they are pointing, but they are pointing it through some other things and through multiple suggestiveness. So, he is telling for poetry has powerful means of imposing its own assumptions and is very independent of the mental habits of the reader. So, poetry, according to him, has powerful meaning of imposing its own assumptions. When we are going through poetry, what happens? We get influenced by the poetry or the poet. We enter into that particular mood. We are going through either love poetry, war poetry, or maybe the poetry of irony and all that. What happens? That we easily enter into that mood. How? It is because of the language, it is because of that layered, ambiguous language. So, he is telling, he is dividing ambiguity into two types. The first one, he is telling that uh, is the simple, ambiguous language of poetry, where the poetry is having the own assumption which imposes, and the ambiguity comes from multiple suggestiveness. Then, in page 62, second paragraph, he is telling the example of the second type of ambiguity in word or syntax occurs when two or more meanings are resolved into one. So, it is the second type of ambiguity where in a word or a sentence we find two or more meanings are resolved into one. One is several meanings conveyed through the uh, creation of poetic mood, and another is through word or syntax. And he is telling that there are alternatives even in the mind of the author, not only different emphasis as in the first type, but an ordinary good reading can extract one resultant from them. And he is now telling that there are 7 types of ambiguity. So, what are the 7 types of ambiguity? He is telling in that paragraph, he is telling in general, complexity of logical meaning ought to be based on complexity of thought. That is the first type of ambiguity. He is telling that uh, ambiguity can be created through complexity of thought, which results in complexity of logical meaning. That means uh, it provides its own assumptions, such as the example, "Come, thou mortal wretch, be angry and dispatch." That means there is a complex thought, and this complex thought is bringing a complex logical meaning. You come, mortal wretch means man, but who is a wretched person. Be angry and dispatch. You get angry by my action and go away. But it is not that simple. Why a wretched mortal will be angry? That means the speaker is doing something to him. The speaker may be telling him the truth about his nature. The speaker may be doing some harm to him. The speaker may be trying to expose his nefarious activities, etc. etc. Then he is talking about the second type of ambiguity. And the second type of ambiguity occurs when two or more meanings are resolved into the one. It is the ambiguity in word or syntax, already we have discussed. That is where one main meaning, there is only one main meaning as a resultant. For instance, if it is an example of the first type to use a metaphor which is valid in several ways, it is an example of the second to use several different metaphors at once. So he is telling that there can be several meaning in the word or the syntax, and it can create a sense of multiplicity through different metaphors. The third type of ambiguity is verbal ambiguity. It occurs when two ideas are connected by their relevance in the context and expressed through one word simultaneously. It is also known as ambiguity of derivation. That means when two ideas are connected by their relevance in the context. In the same context, two different words, they are related. That means suppose you can take the word uh, uh, cut, C-U-T, cut. So cut means cutting. So what will cut? We can cut any visible physical object. You please cut the paper or the cloth. But if somebody will say that I will cut your career, so what happens? That here the word cut is ambiguous. That means it is exactly not cutting somewhere into two different parts. It means destroying. So cut here means destroy. So there are two meanings blended together. The fourth type of ambiguity occurs when two or more meanings of a statement do not agree among themselves but confine to make a more complicated but clear state of mind in the author. And Empson presents that it is often found in dramatic expression and as a setting for the third type of ambiguity. The third type of ambiguity is the verbal ambiguity. So, this type of ambiguity is a setting for the third type of ambiguity. That means in a drama, a character speaks the dialogue. Suppose the dialogue is, I can kill you, I can finish your family. So, I can kill you has different meaning. I will finish your family is a different meaning. Killing someone is different. Finishing the family is different. But both these ideas are blended into the same meaning. When I will kill you, your family will be finished. That means you are the lone bread earner of your family, or you are the lone support of your family. So, here what happens? The character is not speaking that because you are the lone bread earner of your family, I will destroy you and destroy your family. But he is speaking two different sentences and they are suggesting one thing. And then the fifth type of ambiguity occurs when the author is submitting to the organic development of the plot. It is generally found in the novels and can sometimes in plays, suggesting the difference between the original expectation and the real finishing. That means these type of ambiguities are used both in novels and in plays or dramas. And here the character or the writer is suggesting the difference between the original expectation and the real finishing. What we as reader expect or the character is expecting within that play and what exactly is happening through this language. We can take an example like this. Suppose someone is talking to someone and is telling, I can make you rich if you invest in my scheme. Just like the network business people tell their clients, we are here to serve you. So, what happens? They speak in such a manner, we feel that actually they have come for our profit. I have come here to serve you. This is the expectation. We expect that these people are serving us. But what ultimately happens? I have come here to serve my interest. Means that character. So we are becoming the pawn in their hands. So expectation and finishing, they're different. So that particular language becomes ambiguous. I have come to serve you, or it is for you. The sixth type of ambiguity forces the reader to invent his own statements, which are liable to conflict with one another and has no particular pronouncement. So, sixth type of ambiguity comes from the reader, because these are criticism of the text and the reader is a part of this text. So, reader invents his own statement which are going to conflict with one another. That means the reader is having different impressions from the same text. The reader is thinking that these two characters are in love, but the reader also realizes that these two are incompatible. When we find that two characters in a novel or in a play, they come along and they fall in love, and one of the character is exhorting the other one by telling, let us come and be united like fire and water. As the fire and water, they blend, let us blend, be united together. Or let us get united like wine and water, for example. So what happens? One character is like fire, another is like water. One character is either like wine, another is like what happens? The fire will be extinguished by the water and the water will be evaporated by fire. So actually this is not a union. This is a mutual destruction. So what happens? The reader is inventing the statement in his own way, which is having conflicting pronouncement. Then the final and the seventh type of ambiguity, which occurs when two separate meanings within a word or suggested values become two opposite meanings defined by the context. And here what happens? It is defined by the context. What is the context? Against that context, that particular language, that particular statement, it becomes opposite in meaning. The moment we say that everything is fair in love and war. So, just look at the things. Everything is fair in love and war. In love or in war, everything is fair. That means whatever you do, it will. If somebody in love betrays someone, that is fair. But is it fair? Can the victim accept it as fair? If the whole world will impose on him and her that it is fair because it is a wisdom, never. It can never be. So that is also ambiguity. We say that this is ambiguous. How this could be? Or sometimes our wisdoms are also ambiguous when we say that in Mahabharat, Krishna has said that you surrender to me, I am doing everything. So, if this is the concept, because in India, most of the lazy fellows, they always say, God has told us He is doing everything. We are nothing. We are simply the pawn in His hand. So, they take all the liberty, they do nothing, and they exploit their family, and they do all sorts of nuisance. Do you think it is that? No. God is there to take all responsibility, but who will work? We have to work. Unless we work, nobody can come to our rescue. Nobody can come and provide us the good things of life. So, that is an ambiguous statement. So, in this way, what we find that Empson is discussing ambiguity as an expression of a very complex idea through a sudden perception of an objective relation, and he refuted the views of Richards that emotion, as suggested by word in poetry, is independent of the lexical sense. So, Empson is subscribing to the idea that poetry is ambiguous, and simple prosaic statement is also ambiguous, but poetry is the ambiguous personified. Therefore, from the critical point of view, when the critics look at the literary text, they must take the cognizance about this lexical meaning in poetry. So, I think your idea about ambiguity is clear.